Good morning. Good morning and welcome. We're going to give it just one moment before we get officially started to give folks a sec to get in and join us. Good morning to those just joining. We're just taking a moment to let folks filter in. Welcome. All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Boston Green Ribbon Commission's online learning platform, which is called the GRCx. Thanks for joining us. I am Annie Lunston, and I co-staff the GRC's Cultural Institutions Working Group. Our working group is composed of about 35 of Boston's most well-known museums, green spaces, and cultural attractions. We define cultural very broadly around here. Our group's mission is to drive, organize, and support Boston's cultural organizations in equitable responses to the impacts of a changing climate. And our vision, different from our mission, is for all members to meet net zero, resilience, and climate justice goals by modeling best practices and learning from others. So, in the spirit of learning, we are delighted to be hosting today's program on the House of the Seven Gables coastal resilience planning efforts. So, a little bit about the Seven Gables. The House of the Seven Gables has been in operation since its founder, Caroline Emerton, saved and restored the namesake house to its 17th century appearance and opened it for tours in 1910, using the funding to support settlement programs to benefit Salem's local immigrant community. The Gables organization continues to honor this legacy today, using the historic site to tell the challenging story of Salem's history through the lens of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who made the Gables famous, while uplifting and supporting immigrants by providing ESL and citizen classes and advocating for immigrants' rights. So that is the site that we're going to be talking about today. Our presentation is being made by Paul Wright, a historic preservationist and the House of the Seven Gables Director of Preservation and Maintenance. During his tenure, Paul has led the organization in developing its climate adaptation plan in conjunction with a campus plan update. Paul came to the Gables with an extensive background in decarbonization and weatherization of historic buildings, and also studied the intersection of vernacular and sustainable design. So the plan Paul is about to show to you is totally unique in its scope and rather remarkable in its timeline. It is a really palpable reminder that managing for climate is a very long game. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you for the introduction. Let me pull up my slide deck and share my screen before I start talking, because the last time I did this, I forgot to do that for a while. So here we go. All right, there we go. Yeah, so thanks again so much for having me to talk about our climate adaptation plan. I just to speak a little bit on my background, and how it pertains to the report. You know, I came into this type of project with much more of a background in the climate mitigation or decarbonization side of things. And when I was still in school, we were basically learning how we shouldn't be doing adaptation planning because that'll make us not focus on stopping climate change. And then one of the things that came very quickly to very clearly is that we cannot, delay this type of work. We got to walk and chew gum at the same time. So that was what befell me as I came into the House of Seven Gables, is having to both look at what things we can do to reduce our carbon impacts, but also prepare for climate change. And so I'll dive into our presentation now with a little introduction about the layout of the site. So some of you may be familiar with the House of Seven Gables, some of you may not. But we are a historic site located on Salem Harbor in Salem, Massachusetts. We are basically situated around the namesake House of Seven Gables. Can you see my mouse in the presentation? I'm going to do like highlighting of things. I think the share screen should show that. Okay, thanks, Annie. So the House of Seven Gables, which is situated right here, this is our map that we give to everyone who comes on site. We also have three other historic site buildings that were moved to our site. We have the Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace, moved in 1958. We have the Hooper Hathaway House, which is on the closest to the water over here. And then we also have the Retire Beckett House, which was moved in 1924 onto the site. And then we have a few other ancillary structures. We have our visitor center, built in 1993, modern construction. We have a counting house, which actually is undetermined previous use, may have actually been on a wharf, may have been a gardening shed, but we interpret it as basically like a counting house from Salem's Great Age of Sail. But we're located right against the water on the water's edge here. Just out of view, we have a maintenance facility kind of on the edge of the property here, kind of away from everything else. And then, of course, we don't highlight on our tourist map, but we have an administration building called the Pippin House. And then the history of our organization, which was already brought up in the introduction, is that we were organized and founded with a mission to support Salem's immigrant community. So we were part of the settlement movement. Caroline Emerton was a social reformer who wanted to, preserve these buildings as a means of, on one hand, raising money to support immigrant services, but also to teach immigrants about American history. So, we continue to honor some of the portions of that by, like I said, providing ESL classes, citizenship classes, and just general support for Salem's immigrant community. And so we have sort of a social charge. And when I came in here to the Gables, I saw speaking about climate change and its impact on, the city of Salem as sort of a continuation of that. Because in many ways, climate change impacts the most vulnerable, and immigrant communities often being that community that is most vulnerable. All right, so when I came here, and actually before I was even at the House of Seven Gables, we started seeing some initial signs of trouble throughout our site. Again, just to reorient you, this is the Gables, Visitor Center, Counting House, Seawall, Water's Edge. So back in 2017, we had started getting a lot of washout from our seawall, which did have some deferred maintenance, but that washout led to basically a sinkhole opening up, and actually one of our guests, unfortunately, stepping into it. So not a great thing to have to do, but we found that even when we filled it in, there's continual recession because we're getting just more battering waves against our seawall, higher up than we normally were. Tides are getting higher and higher against that seawall. Stormwater is another major issue that we see. So we see it in multiple buildings. There's two areas that were highlighted. This is water inside the basement of the Gables that comes in. This is our gardens here that are up against it. It kind of acts as a bowl pushing stormwater up against the house. And then this is Hooper Hathaway's basement entrance. And you can see the water is just filling up the step here. But the other interesting thing is that basically the bottom of the steps here, this landing is almost at sea level. It's borderline mean high tide. So, even if, we were to cut a drain in there, it may not be the best in helping keep things from, because we have to think about the way the tide is going to impact the groundwater as well. And then, so of course, that water gets in the buildings, and what does it do? It releases into the air and creates all kinds of humidity issues, which is an issue for our collections. So we were recording very high levels of relative humidity inside the buildings, at one point. This is the Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace. We had some mold spores coming up into the building. We had to take collections out and dry them out, and it was just a big problem. So let's see if this video will work. Some of our more recent storms that we had, just for demonstration. This is our maintenance building, the Prim House, and this is the water coming up against the seawall. And the water got higher. I wasn't actually there for the highest points of this storm, but as you can see, the water is overtopping the seawall there and gushing out as well. And this is the stormwater coming in that stairwell that I showed you before. This is it from the interior. So some pretty dramatic examples of how climate change is already hitting our site. And, we had to basically, we've been having to pool our resources with other people to try and find out what we're going to do about it. And fortunately in Salem, we had a lot of interested people who were working on the same thing. So this kind of very closely mirrors what, the Green Ribbon Commission and the Cultural Institute Working Group are trying to do. So in Salem, we got together with a group of partners and we had a conference starting in 2021 that was people trying to talk about their shared issues. And it's continued on actually each year. But through that conference, and I guess I should put in a little plug here, we're having our 2025 conference, Preservation in a Changing Climate, Wednesday, September 17th. You can go to preservingsalem.com and keep an eye out for when we have registration out. It's not active yet, so I'm giving you early notice. But the conference allowed us to partner up with some people who we normally wouldn't, specifically Salem Sound Coast Watch. So Salem Sound Coast Watch is a local environmental group that deals with environmental issues related to the harbor, stormwater, coastal storms, anything related to that. And they connected us with a grant that they were very familiar with applying for, which is the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management Coastal Resilience Grant. And they even helped put us together with some of these partners, Collins Engineers, Horsley Witten Group, and Union Studio, each one of them with a different specialization. Collins Engineers or seawall engineers, Horsley Witten groundwater management or just site water management, and the Union Studio, which they had done a lot of work in Newport on preservation and resiliency. And so they all came together to be our partners for this 2-year research grant. And all throughout that adaptation planning process that we did those 2 years studying it. Oh, what happened? The screen went blank. Okay, let me just do a new full screen. Technical issues. Oh.
We can still see your screen, Paul.
You can. Oh no, yeah, you can see my screen, but it's the presentation has gotten stuck. So let's see. I might have to do it through notes. What's happened here? There we go. Okay. So I'll just jump into our 2-year planning process. So the year one charrette, basically the year one was about collecting data. We also talked with our neighbors, talked with people, the city, the national park site, which is not far from us, and talked with what they're experiencing and solutions they've been looking at. And then we gathered site data to find out what are going to be our long-term issues. And then year 2 was really focusing on how to consolidate this data and plan. So it was a very lengthy process that we did. So some of the data that we collected included boring holes and monitoring wells throughout the site. We did a very detailed elevation and subsurface survey to get a sense of, where are the low spots, where are we in relation to mean high water and stormwater. Tidal gauges to measure, what are the actual tides, not just taking general information from, sources like NOAA. And then test pits behind and seawall inspection. And we overlaid this all mostly with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute maps, which are doing projections on sea level rise and increase of coastal storms. Here's some of the locations of our boring wells. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 monitoring wells, which are actually still actively monitoring groundwater. And then we did 2, just soil boring holes just to kind of get a sense of what the type of soil conditions are behind our seawall. So the main threats that we identified. So first, just looking at sea level rise, the stars on our site, you might be tempted to think, oh, we're actually in pretty good shape, comparatively. A 6 foot means sea level rise is not going to go too far on our site. We might start touching, Hooper Hathaway, and definitely is going to hit our maintenance shed, perm house over here, and the counting house. But that's not the only issue. Our main issue is storm surge and the way that that's going to become more impactful on our site. Higher tides means we are in I should back up. We are in a velocity zone, which means that wave action can come and impact our site. And so even just a few feet of sea level rise or even a few inches of sea level rise is going to impact how far in those storms are going to come up on our site. So just kind of talk about the way that those storms come in the direction. We have basically an open channel, which is quite open to a nor'easter. Now, that said, we do have a marina right to the right of us over here, or to the east of us, which somewhat deflects stormwater and storm surge and wave action. That marina actually is a concrete damper dock. But then what happens is actually it bounces off of our neighbor's seawall. Sorry, not seawall. National Park wharf, and then deflects back on us. And the video that I showed is kind of poor quality, but actually pretty much illustrates that because that corner's over here and you see the waves coming in and hitting off of that direction. So this is all to say that what happens on your neighbor's property, the way that they raise seawalls, it impacts you. So here's kind of a look of the layout of our street. So this is our seawall over here. This is the marina next to us. We have seawalls that are also owned by the city, private seawalls, and then the national park site just a few blocks down from us, plus that wharf that kind of extends far out into the water. And all of these, have people with different priorities, different funding availabilities, and trying to figure out what to do with that to combat storm surge is, of course, very difficult. Then the other thing that we had to look at is groundwater and stormwater runoff. So we identified kind of our key areas by charting basically the elevations on our site, finding out where water tends to accumulate. We know that climate change means that higher precipitation levels are going to exacerbate the issues that we're already seeing present. And then we also know that the groundwater, the ability for the ground to or basically the amount of saturation that's going to happen in the soil around our buildings is going to become more and more of an issue. That's impacted by sea level rise, and it's also impacted by the increased runoff. So, some of the buildings that we're already seeing issues with, it's actually interesting. Our archive basement, which is our modern visitor center, is already seeing observed high groundwater meeting the bottom of its foundation. Fortunately, it's the only building that was built to modern standards with a water barrier on the outside that keeps that from coming in. But that's not the case for Hooper Hathaway, Retired Beckett, and then also the Gables itself, which is about the same elevation as Retired Beckett over here. So those buildings are all going to start seeing in their fieldstone foundations water seeping up just because high tide is reaching that level. You add stormwater on top of that, and that's going to become more and more of an issue. So then we started looking at solutions, and we looked at everything from, minor, quick, low-hanging fruit fixes like improving our gutters, adding rain barrels, and talking about ways to make those look historically appropriate. You can see in this gutter here, we extended it just basically by sticking out the existing profile a little bit further. We talked about how fencing and rainwater barrels, we have a lot of fencing on site, so we can use that to disguise them. But then we had to talk about much more impactful solutions as well. So that includes putting rainwater collection dry wells throughout the site. We've got basically plans to put those in the garden. We identified 4 key areas of the garden, which is sort of, again, that full area that then pushes water towards the gables. Hooper Hathaway, pulling water away from Hooper Hathaway, and then behind the Daniel Hoffer birthplace, and then also basically decreasing the amount of impermeable space that we have on our site. So making pathways, permeable, and then also allow that to collect water into central storage areas. Then we looked at storm surge. What can we do to improve our site storm surge wise? Now, this is where I always kind of forget that I forgot to mention we were talking about raising the seawall. So that was our first solution when we came into this is, well, we just raise the seawall and we buy ourselves time. Going back to the map that I showed you about it, though, with the storm surge coming around, we know that storm surge is, for the most part, going to, even if we're able to deflect some wave action coming head on, a lot of it's going to be coming from angles at us, either from either side based on deflection. And that means that those walls will just end up pooling water behind us. So we had to abandon the seawall first strategy. That said, we also knew that we still needed to improve our seawalls. And that would mean first maintenance, because it needed to be repointed. And that's something that anyone with a seawall should be prioritizing. But then on top of that, we knew that storms coming over the top of the seawall, if we don't pour a stem wall, this is a dry laid seawall, if we don't pour a stem wall behind it, it's going to topple it, with waves coming over it more and more. And we need to have a drainage infrastructure in there that allows to relieve that back pressure as well. And then we also looked at, all right, so if we can't use a seawall, what's some other things that we can use to stop this wave? And we looked at, building adaptations, floodgates, building ramps and dams that we might be able to put around the perimeter of buildings. And then we also talked about moving buildings based on, what are the threats? Can we raise them? Can we abandon first floor? Can we do wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing? All of these were evaluated using basically that the solutions rubric, which is feasible and affordable, reduce flood risk, and keeping historic character. But one of the things that we had to really evaluate is some of the things that kind of come in as the more least feasible and affordable. If we do kind of the half measures, we may end up and look at the further scheme of 2030, 2050, and 2070. We do the cheap thing in 2030, we're going to end up having to do the more expensive thing later in 2070. So it doesn't make sense to put a lot of money into something that we're going to have to eventually undo. And that was something that really kept coming up over and over in our conversations. But this basically allowed us to create a grading rubric for what is going to be the most applicable solutions. So then we created the trigger points. And again, this was mostly based on the 2030, 2050, and 2070 timeline that we use. So you can see that here, 2050 levels and groundwater levels, and we also mapped out those 3 timelines in storm surge as well. So this shows the 2070 actually, but we overlaid that with the 2030 and 2050 projections as well. And so this was, again, was just another mapping technique that we used, the timeline projection, 2030, 2050, 2070. And then, so here's what we did is we started first trying to start from the beginning and work our way to 2070. And so I have a little case study to talk about how this quickly became a bit of a problem. So first we started out looking at, all right, what are our trigger points in 2030? Regular inundations by coastal storms undermining seawall. So we know we need to improve our seawall, otherwise it will collapse with more frequent inundation. Well, one thing that's in the way is our counting house, which is sitting basically right on top of that seawall. So we got to get the counting house out of the way. It's also, threatened by flooding itself. So it doesn't make sense to pick it up and move it someplace else. Raising it is not great when what we're trying to do is increase the accessibility of our site. So we said, all right, it's a small building. Let's go move that to our parking lot, and then we'll improve the seawall once that's moved. All right, then our next issue, our maintenance building. We talked about elevating this one. What we need to raise it to meet the projected flood impacts on there is 6 feet from its current site. We generally use this for storage for lawnmowers, snow blowers, those types of things. It sits on a pretty small parcel. the ramp that we'd have to build to make that thing elevated and still useful would take up probably more than the postage sized lot that it sits on. So then we said, all right, then we're going to have to move the Prim House to the parking lot too. You might see where this is continuing to go. We looked at Hooper Hathaway. Can we flood-proof it in situ? So we talked about how we can, seal off the openings, put flood-proof door on it, install sump pumps. That's all feasible and in the short term. We talked about removing so eventually we're going to start getting water coming into the basement though from groundwater. So we know we have to get everything out of there. So where are we going to put those things? When we talk about building a new maintenance facility to put our wood shop and our into another building, and currently the only land for doing that is our. So we talked about moving it to Prim, but then we already said, well, we're moving Prim too. Then we said eventually the storm inundations by 2050 are going to start making it so that way Hooper Hathaway, the landscape around it is going to be damaged so frequently that we're going to need to actually relocate Hooper Hathaway or come up with some elaborate solution for that. We started realizing we're having a little bit of a traffic jam in our parking lot. We're planning too many things all going in the same place. We need to have a final vision. We have to actually work backwards. Start at 2070, look at the worst case scenario for 2070, and envision how we're going to change things and get us to that point. And we did that in one of our first charrettes, actually. We talked about that. But the first try was kind of a mess. So you'll see we just kind of threw things in there, moving the visitor center up front curb. People have been wanting to build a new visitor center in our parking lot area forever. And now we realize we have to actually prioritize the historic buildings for that site. So we kind of created an orderly 2070 vision. And that vision was based on our history. So I'll get in a little bit into why moving buildings is controversial from a historic preservation background. But something to know is just that we have moved buildings to preserve them many times in the past. Salem, as a community, has a huge history in it. There are other, sites in Massachusetts, Nantucket, obviously, doing a lot with relocating buildings. But this was part of our legacy and our history, is moving buildings to preserve them. The other thing is that our site, we try to portray the site as this, amber encrusted historic site, but the House of Seven Gables and the neighborhood around it has constantly been changing. So, all the way back in the 1700s, and the Gables itself kind of sat a little bit by itself by the water, but then very quickly, the neighborhood densified or became much more of an urban working class neighborhood around the House of Seven Gables. In fact, that actually plays a part in the story of the House of Seven Gables. If you've ever read it, if you haven't, I don't blame you. There's a little bit of a slog, but it basically tells the story about a family descended from a wealthy ship captain, and they fall into hard times, and so the woman descendant of the family has to work in a penny shop basically to make ends meet. And the neighborhood, of course, around here has massively changed. And so that's what we see happening up until the time that we become a historic site, and we slowly hollow out the space around us to make it a very purpose-built museum site. So that's one of the things we looked at, is what is the connection of our site to our neighborhood, to our neighbors, and how has that history changed over time? And so what are these changes that have happened? Well, the neighborhood is densified around us and then undensified. There's buildings relocated. There are many disasters that happen. Lots of fires have happened in the history of the site. And those fires have actually created fear that's caused the museum to actually buy and then tear down buildings just to protect the Gables and the historic sites that were moved. So demolitions. New additions, the House of Seven Gables was a major restoration project. The buildings on our site have not undergone change throughout their history. A lot of the buildings before they came to our site were oriented in a different way. They used to be, situated on a street facing, facing out. Then when they were all moved here, they kind of turned in. That's create a very inward-looking site. That's the colonial revival style that this site was built in, early 1900s, kind of romanticizing historic site. So we looked at trying to honor all those, but then also keeping in mind the constants. So the location of the site, the story tells about the location on Turner Street that made the House of Seven Gables famous. And it's also very important to the context of the House of Seven Gables being in Salem, being close to that maritime tradition and the history, and then the historic and architectural prominence of the house. And then, of course, our organization as well. So what will be the next generation of the campus? So before we went around and looking into the organization, we wanted to talk about some priorities and principles that we had for this. One of the big things is that we wanted to, for the overall site, and I won't go through all of these, but the two most important ones to me is that we're going to de-emphasize parking, basically. We're not a parking site. We are a historic preservation site, history site. And we want to focus on, when we make these expansions, not trying to, as we retreat from the water, not turning that into new parking. And then the other thing is the relocation of historic buildings taken into account, but not necessarily beholden to their past context and orientation. And that's because they have multiple past contexts because they've been moved. So what we want to do is then take that and then shift it to a priority that we want to send to our neighbors and telling them about, what our intentions are with this change. So the Secretary of Interior standards, guidelines, and flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. New site must be located outside the established flood risk area, but similar in character to the original setting. So that was something that we knew we had to do, was look at that 2070 and say everything that we move has to be dry. And then the routes between the historic location and the new proposed site must be suitable for transporting a building. So that's the challenge, of course, that we still have to work out. But we'll take a look at that next. So move buildings a few times. Consider it as a financial, proposal. This is meant to save us costs on rehabilitation and restoration after each storm. That is the intent. But then maintain a thoughtful composition and cohesiveness of the campus through its transition. And then, of course, continue in this in a way that we can continue supporting our settlement programming. So we looked at this as a potential for opportunities, really. Staff and visitor-friendly campus, reduce programming inefficiencies, improve our building infrastructure. And so each time we're moving the buildings, look for opportunities to kind of consolidate some of that infrastructure, and then also make it more accessible. So looking at how people are able to enter each building, can we bring it closer to grade? Can we work with the landscape to make that more accessible? Free up more space in historic homes for interpretation and exhibits, and then a new context to educate the public on climate change, adaptation, and resiliency and mitigation. We have a large outdoor space that we use for events, so we wanted to still make sure that we have that, and we will still have that. It'll just be a little bit different, less of the colonial revival formal gardens, which we still plan to keep in some respect, especially close to the gables, but not as close to the water, because that type of landscape is not going to survive the amount of inundations that it'll be getting. And then a purposeful visitor center with improved amenities and programming. And then, of course, the main thing, to reduce disaster prep, resource management, and post-disaster cleanup. So here is us now looking over with that big gap of that parking lot. And this is it. It's turned a little bit, the final vision that we had in 2070. So you can take a look at it very quickly. I will look at, this is a lot to do. It's a lot to do even over, 40 to 50 years, which is our goal, is our challenge. So we have to break this out into phases that are more manageable. And this is just the side by side. So phase one is targeting our most vulnerable coastal threats. Prim house moving, actually we looked at building a new facility and offloading the prim house from our risk, including having to manage and maintain that seawall. We look at removing the counting house up to the parking lot so that way we can make the seawall improvements that we need. And we look at floodproofing both Hooper Hathaway and the Gables. We can't start too soon with the Gables, even though its coastal flood threat is a bit more advanced. This is our most valuable building. We want to protect it, keep it in sight for as long as possible. And then phase two is really about this will be our first big move, relocating the counting house. Sorry, not the counting house, the Hooper Hathaway house away from the water's edge. We look at reorienting it to its original disposition from where it was moved on Washington Street, so in a different location. So orienting it perpendicular to the street. This kind of reflects its history as being the old bakery that people used to come in and out of along the street's edge. And then also, as you see here, as we're retreating buildings, we are planning landscaping that is meant to be more native and also be a buffer and absorbing wave impact. The next phase is looking at moving the retired Beckett house and Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace. Sorry, it's a retired Beckett and Nathaniel Hawthorne birthplace. And this is basically filling in a street edge here. We are basically mimicking the neighborhood that we are in, saying, this is an urban neighborhood. We are kind of filling that back in, keeping the parking lot from being sort of this gaping hole that kind of divides us from the rest of the neighborhood. And as you can see, sort of again, the development of this space into more of a natural buffer. It also plans for kind of relocating some parking, making this more of a maintenance access area, maybe more, visitor parking up here, and then maintenance and access over this way, employee access this way. But you can see that the site is still self-contained, so we have fence edging in there as we move things along. Then sort of an eventual planning, this was one of the big things that we had to curb, is the desire from the board to always look to make a new visitor center grand and take up a lot of space. The idea is that we would essentially cut off a section of the visitor center, which is actually somewhat historic, built in 1910 by Joseph Chandler, the same architect who restored it, and turn that into basically a new entry ticketing area, and then do a new programming space along the water's edge. This is about where the flood, storm coastal flooding tends to stop, is right up along here. And then eventually phase 5 is, and again, this is part of the very difficult process, which is, do we move the Gables itself? We talked about a lot of different things. We talked about raising it. We talked about letting it basically fall into the ocean. So, basically say, do we just let the waves take it? But what we thought is that if we can move it, we want it moved and kept along Turner Street. The process it takes to raise the building, often in many cases, it essentially makes it the same feasibility to eventually just move it along that much further. So we said, if we're going to have to do that, we might as well bring it to dry land. But we would leave a relic of its foundation for people to witness its original location, which is so important. It has its original foundation, which is almost 400 years old, will be 400 years old at about the time of this relocation. So there is that final vision again. And that's basically the end of my presentation. There are so many different aspects of the planning process that are hard for me to condense into a 30 to 40 minute presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
So we do have the chat open for questions for Paul. So do a little thinking. It's a lot to absorb. And please enter questions into the chat. But I will just get us started. Paul, could you talk a little bit more about the Gables neighbors and sort of how Gables sits within, you mentioned sort of the larger community a number of times. You mentioned the maps of the seawalls sort of all along, and you have one, but others have others. And sort of what kind of communications did you have with them? And sort of how were you thinking about your position within a wider network of folks?
Sure. Yeah. So our most immediate neighbors is the city, and partnership with the city was an important aspect of the planning process that we wanted to talk with them a lot. I'm trying to, sorry, hold on. I just want to zoom into this because it's the best visual representation of what we're talking about. Here we go. Yeah, so the city bounds us on both sides, Hardy Street and Turner Street. And one of the things that we kind of first learned right now is that the city just does not have the capacity to keep up with the demands that we need to protect our site. They are dealing with maintenance backlogs that are just so extensive. So while they are very interested in supporting us, and I think have very intention to want to, um, they are dealing with basically other climate adaptation priorities that are higher than us at this moment, despite us doing our squawking. So, but one of the things is that, so we realized that, we can't raise our seawall because basically the water is just going to come around from us, both from city seawalls and private seawalls to our either side of us. But what we did is we wanted to create a thoughtful plan that processes things so that way as we go, we're going to keep checking in with the city. We keep checking in with private homeowners too. In fact, we actually had one of the homeowner in this lot over here reach out to me in the last week. And we've been putting out this report everywhere that we can because we want our neighbors to know, this is what our intentions are. And for the most part, the neighbors are really interested in, trying to take the lessons for themselves. So one of them reached out to us and said, we're working on it. We want our seawall done. We gave them all the information that we could. But our hope is that what this says to everyone is that this planning that we're doing, we are fortunate to be in the position that we are, that we have this retreat location. And we know that everyone else does not. We're going to do what we can here, but by strengthening our seawall, we can be part of the city's potential eventual strategy to raise seawalls together or create some sort of other alternative plan. And that's why we have this phasing process the way that it is. So that way, perhaps we won't have to get to the point of moving every building. That's one of the things that's like the phasing allows us to defend what we can, check in with our neighbors, check in with the city, and say, all right, we're hitting these trigger points here. We've done this, but we need this community to come together to do this so that we can avoid having to do this. Our neighbors can't move their houses. So what is the city going to do about that? So it's a message to the city essentially and to other landowners that, hey, we've got to do something together. And that's kind of been our communication process there.
Thank you for that, Paul. Yes, definitely a collective effort. We have a couple of questions that are very practical. The first, I think, is really a series of questions that I just want to have you speak to again around the length of this planning process. I believe you said that this was a 2-year planning process, but just to confirm that. And you mentioned that there had been grant funding in partnership for that planning process. And I'd like you to just highlight again what that grant was
Yeah.
and how much it was for.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there and let you just
Yeah.
mention.
So the main grant that allowed us to do this research project came from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. It's called the Coastal Resiliency Grant. And we did a 2-year phase. It was actually around $500,000 for research, but we had match included in there. So it was, yeah, so that's where primarily the funding came from that. We've also, now that we've done this adaptation research, we are looking to go back to this again for some portion of phase 1 implementation. the other places that we've been looking. I guess I should back up. The other thing is that coastal zone management was primarily set up to fund towns, or that's who they funded first. Then they started opening up their funding to nonprofits who held large, conserved spaces. So that, I mean, kind of trustees is one of the big ones, or property management like the trustees. I don't know trustees specifically. We were the first historic site that they opened this up to. So we were supposed to sort of be like a test case for them to see about, historic sites. Can we do this research funding and have it produce, fruitful results? And they've generally been very happy with the report that we put together and been sharing with our organization. So we did try some other people for round one funding. Stormwater management, we did a historic preservation earmark with the federal government. Probably can assume where that's going. We'll see if it is an earmark, which is different than a grant. It's basically pork funding, so there might be a chance at it. We'll see. There is also a seawall repair grant that the state gives out, and under that same office, it does require it to be a publicly owned seawall. So, then you can talk about doing transfer ownership of the seawall over to the public. That might be a potential way going there. Now, granted, that would require the city wanting to take on ownership of the seawall, which again, they've got a lot of seawalls that they are behind on maintaining as well. So funding is a challenge moving forward right now. We're looking mostly to the state and then probably private foundation funding to move forward.
Great. And sort of on that point, there's a question around whether you have a budget for the full breadth of implementation, or are you thinking of it in sort of budgetary chunks by phase? And again, I assume you're working with this timeline of 30, 50, and 70. But is the timeline for implementation sort
Yeah.
of according to that, or is it sort of shorter than
Yeah.
that?
So a lot of the funding, we put together a lot of the funding estimates for phase one. Beyond that, we talked about basically concepts of cost, basically just like comparatively what this thing would cost compared to doing the other thing. But we didn't use concrete numbers, honestly, mostly just due to the sheer uncertainty of trying to predict costs, beyond that range. So that's what we're working with. But so what we got is for implementing our stormwater management site-wide, those four main systems, we were looking at about 250,000 to do that. To do the seawall improvements, we are looking at about $500,000 to do the stem wall. And then relocating the counting house, which is actually the grant we're looking to put together now so we can move things along. Surprisingly cheap to move that building. It was like only $25,000-$30,000. We're trying, of course, to put together a more full package with landscaping and everything like that. So those costs are kind of being put together now for another CZM grant application that we're working on. But we're looking at like a phase one implementation that's going to be like roughly 2 to 3 million, hopefully spread out over the next basically 5 to 10 years. So that way, we're able to make it more digestible. And, with that'll prepare us for up to 2035. And then we got to look at 2035 once we get there and say, all right, what's phase two? So we're prepared for 2040. And, those costs will start probably pulling in the planning, in the latter half of phase two implementation, phase one implementation. Like as we're implementing phase one, we're going to start grabbing costs for phase two.
Yes. And do you feel that having invested the time and money in this planning process and all of the like amazing data and visuals, obviously, that you've been able to kind of gather up has been valuable for the idea of kind of getting the grants, getting the money behind this project? Like, has that process given you, like, what is the value of that?
Yeah. It's it's extremely valuable. I guess without putting a price tag on it. So when I came to the Gables, it was before we were like applying for this grant when I got hired, and but my first charge was to come up with a campus plan. And I will say that the campus plan that I had envisioned before getting this grant was very different from what we had the outcome from here. And I just think about if I had not had this data and the information to put together, the amount of potentially like incorrect assumptions that I would have been making about what's the best thing to do to protect ourselves probably would have sunk a lot of money in bad positions. So it is sort of like if you're doing a campus plan, you basically have to have climate adaptation and data from climate adaptation, uh, you know, data from climate change science implemented in that adaptation report and in that campus plan. Otherwise, it's very likely that you might be pushing yourself in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then there's another question about very practical again about permitting. And,
Mm,
you haven't implemented yet, uh,
yep.
but the
Yes.
expectation, of course, would be that you will be mired in permits. And
Yes.
have you thought
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that? And what are
Absolutely.
your thoughts about it?
And I'll be honest, bits of phase one are really about trying to thread the needle to avoid certain permits, or at least avoid having to go through the full permitting process. Chapter 91 being the most applicable. I don't know how many people here are already familiar with Chapter 91, but basically, if you have land that is on filled tideland, there are requirements to make it publicly accessible, to kind of honor the sort of the state tradition of that the waterfront is accessible to all. So what we've done is technically the Gables is free for all Salem residents, but when we started looking at having to make a modification to the seawall about changing the height of it, they basically said we'd have to install a walkway that would make it accessible to the public. And we are not against making the site more publicly accessible, but it would just create so many programming and challenges that it basically said, okay, well, if we make the improvements to the seawall, that is that going to be maintenance or is that going to be a change? And they said that that's just a change. We said, okay, when we go to the other thing in our retreat, our plan is to make it more accessible so that way we will make it more fit. And in fact, you can actually see that in the final vision. Second one, yeah, that walkway is now open to the public for them to come through. But just as it stands right now, that would be kind of a challenge for us to have that open that way. So it's about taking into account that. Now, the other obviously very specific challenges is going to be things like we have preservation restrictions, historic restrictions. So that's why we talk really about what is the history of our site, creating the historic justification using the Secretary of Interior standards for flood adaptations. So we haven't gone through that process yet. We have been in touch with MHC about, what their thought about it theoretically is. I think they've been hesitant to, say anything too confirming one way or the other at this point because it is a bit conceptual. But there have been people at MHC that we've spoken with who are very positive in the research that we've done here and the support that we put behind it. Yeah, so those are like the two main ones that have been really impacting our thought process here.
Thank you for that. I know we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to kind of close us out by just inviting you to offer any kind of high level advice or don't forget tos to this audience. I know you touched just now on sort of the value of this planning and how critical you feel that it has been to sort of your ongoing thinking about the site and your facilities, et cetera. But just any closing thoughts about like, don't forget or.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one part is just talking with neighbors and stakeholders nearby as much as possible to kind of find out, what they know. I think that the value that we had in talking with national parks service, which is, down the street from us, and what they've been experiencing, and then sharing what we've been experiencing. They didn't know that the waves were bouncing off of their wharf and hitting us. They were doubting it, and then I sent them a video, and they're like, "Oh, okay." And they're planning on raising their wharf even more, which would mean it'll actually send in a storm even higher waves than us. They're like, "Okay, well, we got to make sure that our plan, accounts for that, so that way we can do something that will dampen that impact." So talking about everyone's process affects other people. And our intent is to do this in a way that reduces that as much as possible, so, or at least does it in a positive way as much as possible. So that, and then the other thing is, don't be afraid to discard ideas or don't get stuck on something. We talked for a long time about how we could preserve things in situ using like landscaping, berms, and features. And the data kept coming in that basically just said like this isn't going to work. It's you'd have to build it way too big. It would dominate the landscape, and then you also wouldn't be very effective unless you were able to convince the city to let you buy Turner Street. So you got to be able to adapt to data that's coming through.
Maybe the other way to think about that is dream big.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Don't be afraid to take big steps eventually, because I think when we came to this process, I was like, we're not going to talk about moving buildings, are we? And then by the end, I was like, we can't do this without moving some buildings. And then eventually, it was like, oh, we're moving the whole campus. So yeah, it's um, it's a challenging process for sure. And the whole weight of now, how are we gonna even pay for this? That is no small task. I am very well aware of that. I think the point is to get the messaging out of what the need is. Do what we can right now. Phase one, I think, is achievable with the funds that we have available to us. My hope is that either the messaging through phase one gets out there and says to the city, this is something we got to take seriously. Let's start talking more communally about it. What communally can we do to gather funds to do things like this? And yeah.
Well, hopefully, when you are an old man in retirement, you'll be looking back on this site and seeing the fruits of your labor. So
We
thank
keep joking. My daughter's going to take over.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, Paul, thank you so much for this. This is really fantastic. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and I imagine, can make some of the information that Paul shared today available if folks want it. But thank you again for being here, everyone.
Thank you.